Crafting terrain can be immensely satisfying, taking raw materials and turning into something interesting and playable on the table, either in your war games or D&D. But it can also be quite a daunting prospect to start, and that's the purpose of this video. So I'll be mainly talking about how to get started scratch building terrain, but keep in mind that sometimes it's actually worth either buying a product or even having something 3D printed or 3D printing yourself, but I'll talk more about that at the end. So what you see here is all the basic stuff that you'll likely need, so like a knife, a cutting mat, etc. The knife, for example, whilst at first you can probably use your hobby knife, I would suggest at some point buying an extendable blade. Now you can often pick these up from hobby stores or home bargains or something for maybe like £1, $1. I do have like a list to a lot of this stuff in the Amazon wish list, so if you're wondering what I'm talking about, do check out that. But I would recommend, if your budget allows in this instance, to maybe eventually upgrade to a more sturdy knife. I'm using the all-fat, all-purpose knife, and I think this leads on to the first point, which is don't go past your budget. You can start off here with relatively cheap things and gradually maybe expand and get more sturdy materials and better materials, but really don't feel pressured to go beyond what you're happy spending. For a ruler, I do recommend a metal ruler. This is so that you can make cuts with your knife without having to risk cutting into your ruler. With a plastic ruler or a wooden ruler, sometimes you might end up like slicing little bits off or cutting into the ruler itself. For the hobby mat, any kind of mat should really be fine here. Just pick one that fits in your working space, because they range from A2, A3 or even A4. So pick one that, you know, fits your size. This is obviously so you don't damage your table. Those three things are really your starting point, but there are a couple of obvious materials that eventually you're going to need, so we'll talk about them. And one big piece of advice here is really not to use your standard hobby stuff that you might use for your Warhammer figures or something like that. Generally, making terrain will cause a lot more wear and tear, and maybe using your hobby stuff will be more expensive. An example of that is your paint. If you use the little tubs from Games Workshop to cover all of your terrain pieces, you would very quickly find that your budget would be very high, because they cost quite a lot per milliliter. Instead, you can buy little tubs of like house paints, and you can get these from like Wilko's in the UK, but generally hardware stores will have these kind of like tester pots for your walls. Or you can buy these little like cylinder tubs of acrylic paint or artist acrylic paints. You can get these in the UK from like The Works or Hobbycraft, something like that. And I believe in some dollar stores in the US you can pick these up. A quick note on spray paints. Quite often you don't actually need to spray your terrain, you can just paint on it normally. But if it is a metal or a plastic, you might want to prime it. In that case, I would recommend buying a cheap black or grey spray paint. Now you can get these in the UK from home bargains or even sometimes like pound shop. So look for the cheapest spray paints. You don't want to be using your fancy Games Workshop spray paints. And it's sort of the same for brushes. You can buy a cheap set of craft brush paint, which might only set you back maybe a couple of quid, and these will generally kit you out for making most kinds of terrain, rather than using your fancy miniature brushes, because you don't want to damage them. Now, glues could probably be a topic in their own right. There's two main kinds of glues that I find myself using. One of them is a hot glue gun, which basically heats up a glue stick, melts that glue, and then you use the gun to get it onto the material, put them together, and it will all harden up when it cools back down to room temperature. A cheap glue gun is generally fine. There are fancy ones, but there's no need to extend your budget unless you have a purpose and a requirement. A good thing about the hot glue gun is that it really is very quick, but you can burn your fingers, so do be a little bit careful. The next one is PVA, and I'm going to lump in Mod Podge here. Now you might be instantly familiar with PVA or Elmer's glue, but Mod Podge might be a little bit more unknown to you, and that's okay. For PVA, you'll probably be using like sand and PVA for your bases, so you're probably familiar with that. It is very similar for terrain. The only thing is I would maybe scale that up and buy a builder's quantity of PVA and try and find a bigger quantity of sand rather than say like a little small tub that you can get from Games Workshop or something like that. Now, Mod Podge is actually really great for sealing some kinds of terrain, especially something like XPS, and I'll talk more about XPS later, but it's not actually a requirement. You'll often hear about a black paint and Mod Podge combination. Feel free to just use black paint and PVA. It will do very similar stuff at first, but Mod Podge is like a more finer, better protecting material. It's not a requirement to get Mod Podge, but if you are going to buy one, I would recommend buying the matte over the gloss, unless you have a very specific reason to buy the gloss. Beyond those, you'll probably want something to like texture your terrain. So as I mentioned, PVA and sand, that's obviously a great combination. Another material I'm not really going to talk about here is filler or spackle or junk compound. That can be very handy to create sort of subtle textures and stuff. There's quite a few options, but sand and PVA you're probably familiar with, so I'm not going to talk too much about it. From this point, it really depends on what you want to build and what you have access to. For example, I built a Warhammer 40k ruined building, quite a classic in the gaming community, and this ruined building I made one simply using stuff that you might already have at home. The main structure is actually made from cardboard, but I also made a very similar build using foam board. Now they both have their pros and cons. I haven't personally made it yet, but you could very easily build this out of XPS foam as well. And there's probably many other methods. So that's just one thing that could be made from at least 3 different things as the core structure. So terrain making often isn't, oh, you have to make this one thing using this one material. Quite a few times you're going to have options and you just have to pick what best suits your budget, what's quicker, what's easier for you, etc. Now I'm not going to try and list every single material that terrain makers use, but I'm going to go through a lot of the main ones that are quite common. So let's do that. The first material we're going to look at is polystyrene, and to be more correct, I'm going to actually call it expanded polystyrene. This stuff is the bubbly white packaging material that you get when maybe you would buy a microwave. Therefore, you may often actually get it for free. But hardware stores may sell this in sheet, though if you're going to buy it, XPS is probably more suited, but we'll talk about that in a second. It's mainly now used to bulk up hills, but you can make hills out of it on its own. To cut this stuff, you're going to want a very sharp blade so that you actually slice through it without causing any of the bubbles. It's not easy to work with in that sense, it can be quite difficult. Instead, some people will cover this in a thin layer of filler, spackle, junk compound, something like that. The next one we're going to talk about is XPS. Now this is a very common material that you will hear about and see in the community. It's generally called extruded polystyrene, and it's very similar to expanded polystyrene, except it is actually basically more dense. This means that you can cut it without seeing the small little balls, and that gives a lot more hobby potential. One main issue with XPS is generally they cannot buy it or they don't know where to buy it from. Now I have actually done a video talking about where you might be able to get it going forward. However, you generally want to look in your hardware stores in the US or in the UK. I have often found that eBay is the best place. I will try and leave a link in the description below as well for these. One good thing about XPS is that you can draw into it and carve into it and add detail onto the surface. So you could maybe do like a stone pattern, for example. But one slight problem is if you buy a thin sheet of it, it generally has a texture on it that's not smooth. And this texture might be something that you don't want to show. Quite frankly, with XPS, a hot wire table like the Proxon, which is infamous in the community, is very handy, and it does offer you a lot more potential in what you can build. The Proxon is I think maybe like $80 or $100, I'm not sure off the top of my head. So getting a Proxon is not something I would basically recommend for somebody just starting out making terrain. XPS is generally sold in the UK between 6mm and 50mm, although you can actually get bigger. And I think in the US the common sizes are probably a 1/2 inch and a 1 inch. You should really start using metric though, let's face it. XPS is a great material, but it's not quite the holy grail. You don't need it to make a lot of the terrain that you want on your table. It's just very good for certain things. The next one we're going to talk about is foam board. Now this is relatively a common hobby material that you may see in crafting stores like Hobbycraft in the UK. It's basically a thin, normally about 5mm thick bit of XPS foam sandwiched between 2 sheets of thin card or paper. It's a great solid material for buildings, and if you are creative, you can make all sorts with it. As foam board is 5mm, it's very easy to cut, even with like a hobby knife that you might already have. It is possible to remove the paper from foam board just leaving the XPS sheet. Now I've made a video talking about 4 ways to remove that paper. There will be a link in the description to that. But in the US you can actually buy easy peel foam board and the paper will literally just peel off very easily there. The next material we're going to talk about is cardboard. Now obviously you know what cardboard is. There's 2 main types of cardboard that we talk about really, and that is corrugated card and cardstock. So you can think of cardstock as being like the cardboard from a cereal box. Cardboard is great as it's often free. Corrugated card can be used as a free building material for things like actual buildings, as I showed with my 40k ruined building, but it's quite versatile. I've actually made a hill out of using card and like layering it up to make that hill. Cardstock is great for adding little details. You're generally not going to actually make a proper piece of terrain just out of cardstock, although technically it is possible. One thing about cardboard is that it can easily warp, and I've not really spoke about warping, but but we'll talk about that when we get into the basing section. Another common material you'll see online is chipboard. Now, chipboard in the UK is actually a type of wood with various little chip bits of wood, but that isn't really what I'm talking about here. Chipboard is actually a single piece of thick card, so it's a little bit like a cereal box, but much thicker. Now, graphics medium chipboard is the standard that you'll see, and it's firm and it's good for all kinds of building, as you don't really have to account for the thickness of the material. It's great for details and even just buildings on its own. Chipboard's a great handy material that you can cut easily with a knife. So I just mentioned warping a second ago, and this is really where, let's say you had a big piece of cardboard and you covered it in PVA. Well, you might be familiar that once that starts drying, it'll start warping and bending in various places. Now, that's not something you're obviously going to want for your terrain. Something like cardboard will warp a lot, and something like XPS will generally not warp that much. And that leads me on to basing your terrain. So I just give you quite a few materials that you can make terrain out of, but sometimes you'll actually want to put your terrain on a base just to firm it up and maybe to blend it in with the terrain that you already have, or your mat or something like that. But you obviously don't want to base your terrain on something that's going to warp very easily. There's two really common basing materials I find. The first one is MDF or other kinds of wood. This is obviously wood, and the main issue with wood is that it can be pretty difficult to cut with a knife. However, it can be very, very sturdy. It's not going to bend by force unless you actually snap it, but it can be a little bit prone to warping due to the fact that it's porous and obviously the PVA will sort of soak into it. MDF is a pretty common basing material. You can get thin sheets like 3mm, obviously they're not going to be as sturdy, and they can be cut with a knife. Any thicker than 3mm MDF, then you're generally going to want an actual proper tool, and that might be a power tool like, well, I don't actually know what the power tools are because I don't use any. And then my favourite basing material is EPVC, or sometimes known as Foamex, or sometimes known as Sintra in the US, I believe. It isn't the most common and obvious material that you will have seen around the world. It's essentially a soft plastic that a lot of sign makers use. You might be able to find cheap offcut from a sign maker, but in general in the UK I buy mine off eBay and it's called EPVC. If you can get it, it's a great material. I generally buy it at 3mm thick and you can easily cut that with a knife. For a large piece it's a little bit less sturdy, as in you can actually bend EPVC under weight, but it generally tends not to warp because it can be a little bit hydrophobic. It's a great material for basing though, I do really like it. Now, that isn't an exclusive list of all of the terrain materials and tools you will want. There's all kinds of stuff that you can use. You can use lollipop sticks, barbecue sticks, cork sheets. If you don't have access to XPS foam, you can maybe buy spray foam cans instead. There's all different kinds of stuff out there. Don't be put off if I've mentioned or I've promoted some kind of material that you don't have access to. There's likely some kind of alternative that you will have that maybe I don't have in return. Part of the fun of building terrain is being creative and modifying the technique or the materials used to something that you have access to and that you can create or you need instead. Now, my channel does tend to focus on the more basic build, so if you want to check out trees, hills, that kind of stuff, I do have like playlists with different kinds of methods. As I said, I made a hill out of cardboard, but I've also made a hill out of spray foam. My channel's not an exhaustive list though. There's quite a few resources on YouTube. I won't list all of my favorite YouTubers here, but you know, if you just search wargaming hill, you'll generally find a method that you'll have access to and that you will enjoy. An alternative to crafting terrain, as I mentioned at the start, is buying the terrain, or even maybe getting into 3D printing. Now, 3D printing for me at the moment does not produce a quality of large terrain that I personally enjoy. I find it to be a hobby in of itself, and I don't think it's as fun or as suitable for me. But you might want to research that and decide to get a 3D printer instead maybe. And for buying terrain, there's two different kinds of things I'm talking about here. You can either buy something that helps you make the terrain, so maybe like a proxim cutter, or specifically I'm thinking about trees. So for a tree, you could literally get some wire and make the tree branches yourself. Quite time consuming but quite cheap. Or somebody like Woodland Scenic sell what we call an armature, which you just buy and your tree branches are already there. It's completely up to you to define what you want and what you're happy with. But then there's other things like MDF buildings. Let's say instead of craft building, you actually just want to buy a kit of MDF buildings and you just want to build them using like PVA or whatever. You want to assemble them, paint them and be happy. Fine. Obviously you lack a little bit of the creativity there, and it's not quite as unique because, you know, the design is what somebody else has pre-done, but you might be happy with doing that. I'm just saying there's no right answer. What you want from your terrain is completely up to you. Now, I haven't actually covered absolutely everything here from a basic beginner's guide to terrain making. There's quite a few things I didn't talk about, but it's quite a difficult subject to cover holistically because there's so many different routes you could take and things that you might want to make. For example, building a tree is very different from building D&D dungeon tiles, but the core things that you will need are generally the things that I spoke about for the tools at the start. You know, a knife, a ruler, some paints, some cheap brushes, etc. And don't feel pressured to compete with social media. Make what you are happy with, spending what you are happy to spend, and just try and be happy with what you make. If you have any questions, do either whack it in the comments or join our Facebook group. If you really want to, you can support the channel along with these people. I do appreciate my current Patreons, and if you are considering supporting, I would appreciate that as well. Have a most beautiful day. Goodbye.